Well, this one's been sitting in the dustbin for quite some time, so might as well get it out of the way. This is Columns for the Sega Genesis, essentially the Tetris equivalent of the Sega Empire for lack of a better analogy back in the day. Columns was a game where jewels would fall from the sky, and you have to clear them by matching three of a kind in either a vertical column, a horizontal row, or in a diagonal line. Of course, the limit here is that these jewels always comes in columns of 3, and you can only shift the order in which the jewels appear to match up with the rest. There's no rotating clockwise or counterclockwise or any of that stuff. You just cycle the jewel order in your columns and work with that. And it's a gameplay mechanic that worked for a little while, but nowadays you don't see any columns games unless it's a re-release. And that's a bit of a shame. Columns originally started life as a 1989 arcade game, but eventually made its way over to Sega's home consoles at the time. This Sega Genesis Mega Drive conversion, released in 1990, not only includes an arcade mode similar to how the game played and looked in the arcade, complete with obnoxious hand-holding tutorials, but also two other modes of play. Original mode, which was basically the arcade mode but with more options and no tutorial, and Flash mode, where the main goal is to clear the flashing gemstone. You know, like in that Tetris 2 game, except there's only one flashing thing rather than 3, and no bombs. Of course, if you have a second player on hand, the two of you can compete in the 2-player mode and see who comes out on top, or something to that extent. Columns is one of those puzzle games where it really doesn't matter where you play it, because if you've played one version of Columns, you've pretty much played them all. Any differences between the various ports of Columns are generally superficial, and the core gameplay is generally the same across the board. On its own, Columns bears a concept that is straightforward and easy to grasp. I suppose you could compare it to something akin to Dr. Mario, which also involved rows and columns of light color units, except you're basically stuck with columns of 3 gems or jewels or whatever. And that's your only real restriction. You can shift around the order of the blocks, but you can't rotate them. It should feel limiting, but it works, and it does add tension when the columns are falling at great speeds, your wall is piling up, and you're desperately trying to get that one move in that will save your hide from the clutches of oversaturation. Control in Columns is fine and responsive for a game like this, which is good, although it's not necessarily the best when it comes to high tension or high volume situations. Columns is not the most taxing game in regards to visuals, and what's there isn't the most spectacular looking thing, but in terms of general layout and conveying things that are happening on screen, it is more than adequate. Unlike the 8-bit versions on the Sega Game Gear and the Master System, you only have one set appearance or skin for your gems and they look fine. That's it, they just look fine. They're easy to distinguish, they're not an eyesore, they just look fine. The brown background of the arcade mode is alright, making an effort to at least match up with the theme of the title screens, which look nice, but the original mode has this bland blue tile backdrop that at the very least isn't offensive. It's nothing special really, no endless space or racetrack backdrop like in one of the other versions, but it's just fine and that's okay. When it comes to sound, Columns is not fantastic, but it's alright for the most part. The sound effects are rather weak sounding, almost ear-grating at times, but otherwise tolerable to a point. The music, on the other hand, is also something of a mixed bag and also a case of mileage varying. Columns opts for a more thematic and slower paced music befitting the game's general theme, but the only really standout theme is the default Clothos theme, and even that's somewhat I play Columns on the 16-bit Mega Drive, and I can't help but feel that the game sounds a hell of a lot better on the 8-bit Master System. And then I wonder how I got to a point where a Master System game sounds better in my mind than a Genesis one, but that's the magic of Columns, I suppose. At the end of the day, it's really a matter of preference, and your mileage, as always, may vary. Overall, Columns on Genesis is a perfectly adequate edition of the arcade classic that is a highly satisfying and highly entertaining puzzler that's straightforward and to the point. It's an old standby that nowadays doesn't see a whole lot of action beyond the token re-release and half-hearted remake, but if you enjoy puzzle games of this ilk, then Columns is worth a try or two. It's a fairly cheap game too, so why not give it a go if you're into that sort of thing.